Hi everyone, Amy here with your midweek updates for week 2. I am going to be focusing here mostly on your discussions for this week, which are off to a good start, but I do want to start with just a couple of updates on the news and your assignments in general for this week. So if you haven't already, check out my video here that I posted in the feed where I give you feedback on the assignments from last week. There's some clarification in there on the ideas that you were presenting in your discussion, as well as the open discussion, or excuse me, your writing prompt, as well as the open discussion for last week. Also, we're kind of getting into the semester now, so if you're finding that you are struggling with some of the course concepts, there is tutoring available in the online platform, so I wanted to make that aware to you here, as well as some access to Microsoft Office that you can get for free through your student fees and how to obtain that. So I know I'm requiring you guys to use Microsoft Office, and if you don't have it already, you can get that here. Also, don't forget to check out your to-do list for week 2, which you probably should have already read because you've already had at least one deadline this week. And don't forget, the syllabus quiz is due tomorrow evening at 5 p.m., which is when we have our no-show deadline. There are definitely some no-shows in this class. However, I have been able to go in and check some of those short answer responses by hand and put in the grades if you had maybe just the spelling or the spacing a little bit off, because the computer is very picky about those short answer questions. So if you sent me an email about the syllabus quiz wanting to know why you were getting such a low grade, I have been able to go in and put in some of those points. So go ahead and check out your grade, and if you haven't taken it yet, be sure to take it by 5 p.m. tomorrow. And if you are uncertain about some of the answers or why you didn't get points for a certain answer beyond what I've been able to update by hand, just do go ahead and shoot me an email about that. All right, so I do want to jump in and go ahead and get started talking about your discussions for this week. Also, don't forget that under content for week 2, you're going to have the to-do list there, and you can either access your discussions from this tab at the top, or you can go right down to the homework activities. So let's go to our writing prompt discussion first. A lot of you posted, so that's always good to see. And then some of you have even completed your responses for this week. So those of you who've done so are really off to a good start, and all you have to do on this for the weekend is your reflections after Friday night. So good for you all. Okay, so what this prompt was asking you to do is to pick out what you thought the thesis of this article would be, rewrite it as a quote punctuated correctly, then add an attributive tag, then try to move from quote to paraphrase, and then reflect on the process. So how did you go from quote to paraphrase? What was it like adding in the attributive tag, etc. So I'm going to start by talking about the quotes themselves, and particularly how to punctuate them correctly. So don't forget from the text that your quotations, which are anything that's word for word lifted from the text, are going to have quotation marks around them, like you'll see here. So I want to show Rocky's post because he did the first part correctly, picked out a sentence and quoted it here, but when it came to putting in the attributive tag, I think those quotation marks somehow got lost in translation. So make sure anytime you are pulling word for word from the text, excuse me, because these are exactly the same, this would need to be in quotes. And so the only difference here is, instead of now we have chosen whether we want to venture into the valley of intimate strangers, Rocky has added his attributive tag here. Now, as Johnson points out, we have chosen whether we want to venture into the valley of intimate strangers. All of this would still need to be in quotation marks, and then you would need to start quotation marks again after your attributive tag. So technically in this sentence here, the only thing that should not be in quotation marks is the attributive tag itself. And this is a really good attributive tag, so good job with that, Rocky. I also want to point out that quotes just by themselves are not actually complete sentences. So let's take a look here at Nikki's post. I have to go up, find it. All right. So Nikki did a good job pulling out a sentence here and punctuating it correctly. However, when we got down to the next step of adding in the attributive tag, Nikki has this sentence by itself, then a follow-up sentence with some interpretation, and the attributive tag and the remainder of the quote. And so all of this that I have highlighted here is definitely correct. It's framed in the writer Nikki's voice. She has her attributive tag to introduce the quote, and it is punctuated correctly. But the sentence before this by itself right here would not work as a complete sentence in an essay or in a piece of writing. So you would need to attach to this an attributive tag. And that actually makes sense because this is a separate idea from the article than the one that we see down here. And so every different idea from the article needs to have an attributive tag. And so that's kind of a clue for your summaries, since your summaries are just going to be talking about what's in the article, and since they're going to be relatively concise, jumping from one point to the next relatively quickly, you will pretty much need an attributive tag in almost every single sentence in your summary. So make sure that you don't have any quotes that are just by themselves without attributive tags like this one. I also want to point out that when you paraphrase, your manipulation of the quote into your own words needs to be entirely different from the original, both in terms of vocabulary and sentence structure. And so this is kind of related to what your book calls patch writing, where you basically go in and just replace synonyms for individual words within the quote. And that is not considered effective paraphrase. It is actually considered plagiarism because all you've basically done is used a thesaurus and substituted one word for another. So you actually have to reframe the entire idea into your own words completely and basically change the entire structure of the sentence as it appeared in the original. But that also actually makes sense because in paraphrase, you are trying to summarize or shorten the original quote as you put it in your own words. And so it wouldn't make sense to just sub out word for word, because then you're going to end up with a paraphrase that is equally as long as the original. And so by putting it in your own words and reframing it into an entirely new structure, you can actually condense the quote quite a bit. So let me go ahead and point out an example of that here. Caitlin did a pretty good job addressing what the argument is talking about in general, but Caitlin, moving from this quote, down to this paraphrase, we see a lot of the same verbiage as appeared in the original. So for example, it is as if we are all playing the role of Truman from The Truman Show. And up here it says, the internet was not always supposed to turn into a network version of The Truman Show where we're all playing Truman. So all playing Truman, all playing the role of Truman, that's not different enough. And talking about The Truman Show directly here, even directly referencing Twitter to an extent, is using a little bit too much of this writer's own original words. And then along with that, it's kind of a specific example. So you don't need to talk about specific instances like Twitter or Facebook in your summary, because remember, you're just trying to get at the main ideas that those examples are meant to represent. So you can just talk about people sharing online in general as you're summarizing what his different points are about sharing online. And then I also wanted to point out that attributive tags must contain a verb. So going from the quote, putting it in punctuation marks, this is all correct, but it's not enough to just have like a dash dash Johnson. If you're really doing an attributive tag, this period would need to be a comma, and then you would need to have a verb here instead of dash dash. So something like argues or states. We can look at another example of that in Cheyenne's post way down here. Cheyenne's doing the same thing right here. But then down here, she says, back a few years, like what Johnson was saying, we never would have thought to share every detail of our lives with strangers. So this is a correct attributive tag. It has his name and a verb. And this one is more of just a tag line. It's not actually going to be grammatically correct within the sentence in whatever paragraph you're writing in your summary. So just be aware that you do need to have the author's last name attached to a neutral verb for attributive tags in your summary and your response and any writing you would do from this point forward, basically. Okay, so going back to our prompt, I had asked you, to punctuate correctly and use an attributive tag, but the next thing that you had to do was to actually paraphrase the thesis of the article into your own words. And I actually think that there may be some confusion about what Johnson's thesis is in this article. And it is kind of difficult to point out because he definitely gives a lot of information on both sides and at times even wavers back and forth. But there is a clear, distinct argument that he is making about sharing information online that I need you guys to be able to pick out. So I want to talk about that a little bit more so I can clarify it for you. So let's go ahead and take a look at Cheyenne's original and what she had picked out to be the author's thesis. And I'm just going to go ahead and focus on the paraphrased version. So back a few years, like what Johnson was saying, we would have never thought to share every detail of our lives with strangers. But now we look forward to sharing personal things on social media, and we like to spend countless hours looking at other friends and or strangers' lives. So Cheyenne is definitely on the right track. These are a couple of the most important points that Johnson makes, and so I noticed that a lot of you were picking up on them. But I want to remind you all that the thesis in the text has to be comprehensive of all the points that are made. So these are just a couple of individual points, not the overall argument itself. So what I would encourage you all to consider is, what is Johnson's actual position on this issue? So it's true that he says these things, but is he trying to argue that this is a good thing or that this is a bad thing? And sometimes for the thesis you can look to the title for a clue, and the title of this article is In Praise of Oversharing. So let that be a clue to you that he's actually trying to say that this is a good thing. So not only are we sharing a lot of information online, we're actually benefiting from it, and it provides an opportunity to be a good influence in our lives. So that was really difficult for some of you to grasp. I know a lot of you felt like he was saying that sharing online is actually a bad thing. And there are a lot of places in the article where he warns about the dangers of sharing online. And so it's certainly relevant for you to talk about those things. However, I don't want you to be confused and think that that is his actual position. He is saying that sharing online can be a good thing, even though there are certainly drawbacks, but then there's another step that he adds to it, which is how to share responsibly and how to do it in a way that is going to be safe and that is going to be ethical for each individual person. And he kind of makes the argument that that's something that everyone has to decide on their own. So I want to go ahead and show an example of what I thought was a really strong representation of the author's thesis. It was in Jessica's. She picked out this really long quote and did a good job attaching it to an attributive tag and punctuating correctly. But again, I want to focus on the paraphrase here. In his article, Web Privacy and Praise of Oversharing, Johnson tries to convince the reader that the benefits of putting your private information and photos on the web for all to see outweigh the possible harms. This is absolutely accurate here. He is definitely arguing that the benefits outweigh the harms. It's not that he doesn't talk about the harms, he does, but he says overall the benefits outweigh these harms. But then there is another step that I would add to this, which is basically the idea that everyone has to make this decision for themselves, and it requires a literacy in the virtues and perils of privacy and publicness. It requires understanding what it means to share stuff with people and to let go of some of your privacy. So I would say that although this is a really good representation of most of the thesis, I would want to bring in a little bit more of what he's saying in this quote that you've selected, so that you can get that last little part about we all have to decide for ourselves how we're going to do this responsibly. And then I think this would be a really good comprehensive representation of the author's thesis. I have seen, as I mentioned, some of you doing your responses already, and so that's great, those of you who are already done with the response portion of the assignment for this week. And I have actually seen some pretty strong responses, like here in Chris's thread, although I do want to point out that some of the things you guys are bringing up about privacy and Facebook are a little bit beyond summarizing the author's thesis and could actually relate to some of the points that are in the open discussion this week. That was kind of what I was seeing in Luke's thread as well, not just Chris's. So let's go ahead and take a look at these open discussions. We do have our 3 posts already, so thank you to Nikki, Jessica, and Cheyenne for getting that started for us. And then Amber and Tabitha, you did the right thing by just replying. Also, Amber and Tabitha have a couple of really good examples of what I'm talking about in terms of being able to post as deeply in your replies for open discussion as you would, sorry, I'm getting mixed up here, as you would if you were presenting an original post. So thank you very much for your hard work there, Amber and Tabitha. And then I'm really excited to see where these conversations go. I think some of you, again, are a little bit confused about his thesis as to whether he is in favor of sharing online or not, but I want to see what you have to reply to each other, so I haven't quite weighed in on that yet. So I'll have more in my end of week wrap up, but thanks for your hard work so far this week.